and gave us just perhaps the most famous line in Hollywood history. If I start it, you can finish it. Here we go. Ready? Houston, we have a problem. We got a Pentecostal camp meeting. Well, almost all of you can complete it. Apparently.
You underestimated.
Yeah. Well, yeah, Houston would have a problem. Well, let me just summarize the whole book of Esther this way. It all revolves around this idea. Jews of Persia, we have a problem. That's the whole book. In fact, you can divide the book of Esther into two parts, very neat, 5 chapters each. Chapters 1 to 5, the problem. Chapters 6 to 10, the solution. There you go. That's the book of Esther. The problem, of course, was that there was a contract out on all the Jewish people of Persia. And in those days, Persia basically ruled the world. So if all the Jews of Persia were exterminated, it was just a matter of time before all the Jews on earth. I mean, they were trying to do what Hitler tried to do. They were trying to get rid of them all. It all had to do with one man. His name was Haman, Haman. He was a high official in the court of the king of Persia, whose name was Xerxes. Now, when you read the book of Esther, you're going to read the name Ahasuerus. That's because the Hebrews were pronouncing, in Hebrew, his Persian name. Xerxes was his Greek name. But his Persian name, which you don't care about hearing what that is, but the Jews pronounced it something like Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus, but it's the same. He reigned from 486 BC to 465, 21 years, a crucial time in Persian history. And we'll hear more a little more about that later. The book of Proverbs says that when the wicked listen to falsehood, in other words, if they believe flatteries and lies that people tell them, if they're easily swayed by things like that, then all their associates will be wicked. They'll have a court full of ne'er-do-wells. Well, that's exactly what happened with Xerxes. Xerxes was extremely vain. He was a megalomaniac. And someone like Haman, who was unscrupulous, was able to kind of worm his way into the good graces of Xerxes, and Xerxes wound up making him like sort of the chief of staff for the whole empire. Okay. What happened was, and they know the story, but what happened was that the king commanded that people should bow and scrape before Haman. They should show him due respect. Well, this Jew named Mordecai refused to do that. This is something like Christians in the first century who were required to repeat the words Caesar Kurios, Caesar is Lord. And they refused because their response was, no, there's only one Lord, and that's Jesus Christ. We're not going to say Caesar is Lord, even if it's just perfunctory, even if it's just a formality. We're not going to say it. Well, something like that probably is what motivated Mordecai, so he refused to bow down before Haman. Haman was incensed, and he vowed vengeance, and the vengeance that he vowed was, I won't go after Mordecai himself, I'll go after all of his people, I'll kill all the Jews. And he managed to get Xerxes to sign an order for that. So the Jews were under a death threat. So that's the problem. The Jews were facing, literally, extinction because of the pride and the arrogance of story, you get the lesson that pride goes before a fall, because Haman fell in the most ignominious way, but I'm not going to dwell on that. There are more important things to talk about. But here's what I want you to listen to. I want you to hear this. That before there was ever a problem for the Jews in Persia, God was already at work preparing the solution. How's that? What do we mean by that? Well, let me give you a little bit more history of the Persian Empire under Xerxes. Xerxes came to power in 46. His father was Darius I, Darius the Great. He's known in history as. And Darius had wanted to extend the Persian Empire into Greece, so he started a war against the Greeks. And he had to stop because of a famous battle. You all know the battle. Every year in Boston, they run a race called the Boston Marathon, named for a famous battle that took place in Marathon, about 25 miles from Athens. And supposedly, according to legend, it's probably a legend, we don't really know, but supposedly the Greeks won that battle. They did win the battle in Marathon against a force that outnumbered them like 5-1. And when the Greeks won, a messenger ran to Athens to announce to the city fathers that they had won. And Nikomen was supposedly what he said, we win. And so ever since, the marathon race has commemorated that battle, that astounding victory. So Darius had to stop fighting the Greeks. He went back home, and he died. And his son Xerxes comes to power, and Xerxes says, I'm going to do what my father failed to do. So he comes to power in 46 BC. In 43, he launches his attack on the Greeks. And guess what? In 480, his navy is destroyed at Salamis in Greece. And so Xerxes touched tail and goes home himself. The Persians have been defeated yet again. And they had vastly outnumbered the Greek fleet, but they lost. And they lost their fleet. So Xerxes goes back home. That was in 480 BC. That's where the book of Esther picks up. Just about the time he was ready to launch his attack on the Greeks, Ahasuerus, Xerxes, hosts a banquet. You read about that in the first chapter of Esther. You read about this enormous banquet that went on and on for days and days and days and days and days. And so Xerxes, at some point, probably in a sort of a drunken stupor of some sort, demanded that his queen, Vashti, appear. Well, in Persian kings and queens, they never did that. They never, in fact, it would be rare for a Persian queen to go into public at all. And apparently, he wanted his queen to come and show off her beauty, maybe scantily clad, we don't know, but that's the implication. And Vashti, in good Persian fashion, says, no, I'm not doing this. I'm not going. Xerxes is incensed. He removes her from being queen, but then he launches his attack on the Greeks, so he kind of forgets about it for a while. Is defeated at Salamis and comes back home, tail between his legs, licking his wounds, and trying to find something to replace the emptiness in his life. And guess what he does? He goes looking for a new wife. Guess who it is? Tell me, church. Who is it? It's Esther. And he makes her his queen. Listen to this. In 479 BC, the year after the defeat at Salamis, he's licking his wounds. He's trying to fill up the void with a beautiful woman. You can verify all these dates, by the way. I'm just giving you the Cliff Notes version. But so God is preparing the way, because now Esther is on the throne. And God is going to use her to deliver the Jewish people. Well, how does that happen? Well, it happens through people. It happens through Mordecai and through Esther. I want you to take a look just very briefly at Mordecai and Esther. as individuals. First of all, Mordecai. Mordecai, when he refused to recognize Haman, refused to bow down and bow and sweat and such, when he refused to do that, he was actually putting his own life in danger. You understand this? Because we are told in Esther chapter 3 that the king had so commanded. This is in Esther chapter 3, verse 2? Yeah, verse 2. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai refused. Now look at this. Mordecai took his life in his hands. When he disobeyed the king, that could be a capital crime. He could have been put to death. He disobeyed the king. Then later on we read something very interesting, that this is all part of the way God works to save the Jewish people. But in chapter 6 we read about how the king, after this banquet that Esther hosted for him, that the king couldn't sleep. And so in his insomnia, he tells one of his servants to bring him the chronicles. They kept records of all the king's doings. And to bring the chronicles and read from them. And the servant just happened to read an account of how Mordecai had saved the king. Now look at this. Mordecai disobeyed the king on godly grounds. But he also honored the king. He uncovered a plot against the king's life and exposed it. And so the king asked his servant, what has been done to honor Mordecai for this deed that he did? And the servant said nothing. So guess what the king decides to do? He decides to have him honored. He puts him on a royal horse with all the trappings. And he commands Haman to lead the horse through the city. You'll get yours, Buster. Pride of Orval. Okay, so that's Mordecai. By the way, that's a beautiful picture of what it means to be a citizen, what it means to be a good Christian, because he disobeyed the king on biblical grounds, and yet at the same time he honored him and protected him. I want to tell you a quick story, may I? When I was my first church, I was pastor of a church down in Florida where he served the king, and I was first associate pastor. I was worship and youth and such and such. Well, during those months that I was the associate pastor, the church, somebody had made a wonderful offer to the church that they would take all the pews out of the church and refinish them in antique white with gold edging and crimson cushions. They were beautiful. So it was an offer too good to refuse. I think somebody was volunteered to do it for nothing or whatever. Anyhow, it was a great deal. And so on a Sunday night, the church voted to do that. It was almost unanimous, but there was one man in the church who happened to be the wealthiest man in the church, the wealthiest man in the town, one of the wealthiest men in Central Florida, who voted against it. He was a deacon. He wasn't ugly, he wasn't nasty, he didn't create a stink, he just opposed to it. The next morning, because it had passed, almost unanimously, people showed up at the church to take all the pews out. They came in, pews out, had to go down a long flight of stairs and put them out into the churchyard. And guess who was there working like a hired hand, getting the pews out? That man. I'll never forget it. He's with the Lord now, Lester Austin. Richest man. He built a wing onto his house to house a stuffed polar bear they killed him last night. I can still see that polar bear. Anyway, the richest man in town, the richest man in the church, voted against it. Everybody knew that he wasn't in favor of this, and the next morning he was there helping to move the furniture. That's Mordecai. Now, Esther. What about Esther? Esther also had to take her life in her hands. Remember the passage we just read? What did she say? She said, if anybody comes into the king's presence uninvited, without permission, there's only one outcome, and that is death. unless the king extends his golden scepter, and you don't know if he's going to do that or not. And so she says, Mordecai, I have been called into the king's presence for a month. You want me to take my life in my hands? And that's when Mordecai says to her, if you don't do this, then help will come from somewhere else. But your family, your father's family will perish. So, who knows but that you have come to the kingdom precisely for such a thing. Let me just stop right there and say, you know what? You and I live, while we live and move and have our being, while we have the privilege of life, we live right now, where we are, in this particular period of history, with all your particular life circumstances. And I just say to you, as I look in the mirror and say to me, you are here for such a time as this. God has you on this earth to do something. Find out what it is. And be like Esther. Something else about Esther, though. This is what I really want you to hear about Esther. Turn, if you will, there to the book of Esther. And in chapter 4, near the end of chapter 4, in verse, 15, then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai after he said, who knows but that you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? So Esther says, go back to Mordecai and tell him this. Now look at what she says. Go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, that was the capital, and hold a fast on my behalf. Well, in the Jewish mind, to fast is to pray. The reason you fast is to pray. It is to pray earnestly. It is to pray intensely. It is to pray fervently. It is to pour out your heart to God. So her instructions to Mordecai are, gather all the Jews, every Jew in the capital of Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. And my young women, meaning that I and my caregivers here, I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king. Only after we have prayed and fasted and sought God. Well, of course, the outcome of the story is that she hosts a banquet. Either she loses her nerve, or it was all part of the plan. We don't know, but she doesn't. The king wants to know, why did you want us to go to the banquet? He and Haman. And she says, well, come back tomorrow night for another banquet, and I'll tell you. So the king agrees, and they do, and that's when Haman is exposed, and Esther names, she points at Haman and says, he has a vendetta against my people. And the story is that Haman, who had built a gallows to hang Mordecai, winds up being hanged on his own gallows. So Mordecai then takes the place of Haman and manages to get the king to sign another edict that allows the Jewish people to defend themselves, and the Jews are safe. That's the end of Esther. Okay, but here's the real story of Esther. It's an amazing story, and all the more because it's true. Here's the real story. Both Jews and Christians for centuries have had trouble with Esther. Can you guess why? Anybody have any idea why you would have trouble accepting Esther as a part of the Bible?
It never mentions God.
Yeah. Say it out loud.
It mentions God.
Yeah. It is unique in the Bible. It never once mentions the name of God. Not once. How can a book be in the Bible and never mention God? Well, that's part of the beauty of it. Because Esther is itself a kind of object lesson. I do object lessons for the children in children's room. And the book of Esther is itself a kind of object lesson, because the point of Esther is this. Without ever mentioning God's name, God is at work all through the book. Haman plots to destroy the Jewish people, and what did I say at the very beginning? Before there was ever a plot to destroy the Jews, before there was ever a problem, God was already at work providing the solution. God was at work all through the book to save the Jewish people. I want to close with just a couple of quick applications, a couple of observations that I would make based on the book of Esther. One of those has to do with our revival that we just had this week, a wonderful, wonderful week. I couldn't be here Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. I put that up front, and probably couldn't be. But I also said in several places and several different times, you know what? It's not the evangelist, it's not the music worship leader, it's not the pastor that bring revival. We don't have that power. God gives revival. I tell you why we had a great revival. Because you, church family, spend weeks and weeks and weeks praying. That's why we had a great revival. So we turn to the book of Esther and we see a picture of the week that we've just had, where Esther says, gather all the Jews together and fast and pray. And I'll do the same. And then if I perish, I perish. I'll go into the king's presence, and if I perish, I'm willing to do whatever he wants me to do, and I'll just trust him with the outcome. But let's pray and seek the face of God. Church family, let's not stop praying. Let's not think even for a moment that Wednesday night, the services, the schedule of services ended, but God wants us to experience more and more and more of his power and presence and of his saving grace. And you know how it's going to come? When we pray. We'll have a lot more to say about this in the days to come. God helping me, but God make us pray people, because God works through prayer. What is it Jesus himself said in the Sermon on the Mount? When you pray, don't pray like the Pharisees, making a spectacle of yourself out in public. No. What do? Go into your secret place and pray. And then he adds this word. Remember this? Jesus says, and God who sees in what? Secret. God who sees in secret will award you openly. Pray. People of God, pray. I want to make one more application. There are a lot more I could make, but I want to make just one more for time's sake, and that is this. That the book of Esther, among many other things, one of the most important things, if not the most important thing it teaches us, is that God is always at work, unseen, unnoticed, even unlauded, unheralded, unacknowledged. But God is always at work to accomplish his saving purposes. There are some here today who need Christ. You're not a Christian. You've never really given your life to the Lord Jesus Christ. I know that. I just know. I know it's true. Also know that I was a pastor and lost. You've heard that bits and pieces of that story. Well, how did I know? How did I come to know that I was a pastor and lost? You would think as a pastor, you might kind of veneer over, you would kind of whitewash all of your life and everything about your life, and just rest easy in some kind of false self-confidence. How did I come to know? Well, God was at work. In my case, maybe not your case, but in my case, even though I'd been saved and joined the church and all that, and I was a preacher, I was deeply troubled. Something was not right, and I knew it wasn't right. I went across town to a Jewish doctor and got him to prescribe tranquilizers so I could live with myself, so I could go to sleep at night. Everything was wrong. I started to preach on Sunday, and I just knew something. I didn't know what it was, but something was wrong. You know what? This is the book of Esther. God was speaking to my heart. He was telling me, you are not right with me. have on the outside, you don't have it on the inside. I could go on and on with my testimony, but I'm just saying, God works in secret ways to accomplish His saving purposes. Maybe God is working in your heart right now. You know, I've heard Billy Graham say many, many times that, you know, if you're not a Christian or you're not sure, but you want to be sure, well, what does that mean? What that means is that God is at work to give you a desire for something you don't even know. But you just know you need whatever this is. Or you're troubled because there's an emptiness there. Or you feel like a hypocrite. I mean, 1,000 different ways God can be at work in your life telling you you need Jesus. Maybe God is at work in your heart in a different way today. Maybe God is saying to you, you know, I want you to be obedient to the baptism. I want you to do what these young people did. I want you to stand up and say, Jesus Christ died for me and rose again. I'm going to tell people I'm a Christian. Maybe God wants you to do that. Maybe God has put something, maybe God is calling you to some special ministry. God maybe is working some other way. Maybe there's a relationship that needs to be dealt with. You need to confront something. And God is convicting you today that you need to do that. Well, put yourself in Esther's place. Pray, seek God. And then you'll be good. Let's stand together, shall we?